Peter Pan is supposed to be the boy who never grew up, the fearless hero who escapes the ordinary world and invites us into a place where childhood lasts forever. Neverland was freedom without rules, adventure without endings, and a dream every child understood. But return to the story as an adult, and that dream begins to look strangely different. What if Neverland was never a paradise at all? What if time does not stop in Neverland because childhood is perfect, but because nobody is allowed to become someone new? Peter can fly, fight pirates, and remain forever young. Yet beneath that freedom is something unsettling. He rarely learns, remembers, or accepts the consequences of what he does. Every conflict can simply vanish when the next adventure begins. That makes Peter Pan a far more complicated figure than the uncomplicated hero many of us remember. He is charming, brave, funny, and impossible to resist. But he can also be selfish, careless, and emotionally detached. His refusal to grow does not merely protect him from adulthood, protects him from responsibility. In Neverland, consequences are temporary, memories are unreliable, and even relationships can be treated like games that reset when the story moves on. That is where the darkness of the idea begins to emerge. J.M. Barrie's original Peter Pan was never as simple as the polished image that nostalgia often preserves. Behind the fantasy was an uneasy fascination with childhood, memory, loss, and the fear of change. Disney transformed those ideas into a brighter adventure, filled with color, music, comedy, and wonder. And yet the unsettling question remained beneath the surface. If growing up is presented as the enemy, what happens when refusing to grow becomes its own kind of prison? As children, we side with Peter. Wendy represents rules, bedtime, school, parents, and the mysterious future adults keep talking about. Peter represents escape. He offers the impossible bargain. Stay young forever and never surrender the freedom of childhood. It sounds perfect because children have no reason to fear the absence of a future. Adults do. Because growing up is not simply losing innocence. It is gaining memory, identity, responsibility, and the ability to understand that our choices affect other people. Peter avoids that entire process. Neverland therefore becomes more than magical island. It becomes a strange purgatory. Beautiful precisely because nothing truly changes. And that may be the story's most haunting idea. The real villain may not be growing up. It may be stagnation, the moment when freedom becomes avoidance, when innocence becomes ignorance, and when living forever means never becoming anyone at all. Once we see Neverland through that lens, Peter's eternal childhood stops looking like a gift and starts looking like a question. How much of yourself would you sacrifice to never change? To understand why Peter Pan still feels so powerful, yet strangely uncomfortable, we have to look beyond the image of the flying boy in green. This story was shaped by more than a simple desire to entertain children. It emerged from Barrie's complicated ideas about childhood, was transformed by Walt Disney's creative ambitions, and eventually became part of the larger cultural conversation about what it means to mature. So rather than treating Peter Pan as a beloved animated classic, we are going to take the story apart from several angles. We will begin with the production history, the creative pressures, artistic decisions, and studio expectations that helped Disney turn Barrie's world into one of animation's most recognizable fantasies. Then we will return to the story itself, following Peter, Wendy, Tinker Bell, Captain Hook, and the Lost Boys while asking what their choices reveal beneath the adventure. From there, we will examine Peter's central contradiction. He is liberating because he refuses the limits imposed by adulthood, yet destructive because he refuses the responsibilities that come with freedom. Wendy, meanwhile, is often described as the character who loses the magic by choosing to grow up. But is that really what happens? To answer that, we will compare three different lenses: Barrie's original text, Disney's creative mandates and interpretation, and modern psychological ideas about arrested development, identity, memory, and avoidance. This comparison matters because the same character can look heroic in one era and deeply tragic in another. We will also explore the visual language of Neverland, the separation between bright fantasy and darker behavior, the constant movement contrasted with emotional repetition, and the way flight itself becomes a symbol of escape. These details are easy to overlook when we remember the film through childhood nostalgia. Finally, we will examine Peter Pan's cultural legacy and the idea that eventually became known as Peter Pan syndrome. The term is not a formal diagnosis, but it describes a recognizable pattern: avoiding adult responsibility while trying to preserve the freedom and identity of youth. In a culture where adolescence can stretch far beyond childhood, that idea has become more relevant, not less. By the end, the question will no longer be whether Peter Pan is a hero or a villain. It will be whether eternal childhood was ever freedom in the first place. For many of us, Peter Pan is not just a movie we watched. It is a place we remember visiting, Maybe you remember the first time you saw Peter and Wendy rise above London, carried by pixie dust toward the second star to the right. Maybe you remember Tinker Bell's glowing presence, her jealousy, her tiny temper, or the unmistakable sound of Captain Hook's greatest nightmare, the ticking crocodile moving closer through the water. These memories feel almost weightless now. They belong to a childhood when flying was possible because someone on a screen told us it was. Neverland did not need to make sense. It only needed to feel exciting. But adulthood changes the way those moments land. The flight over London can begin to feel less like an escape into freedom, and more like a metaphor for escaping everything waiting below. Hook's obsession with the crocodile can feel strangely connected to something much more universal. The knowledge that time is always following us. No matter how far we run, no matter how exciting the adventure becomes, the clock continues moving. That is one reason Peter Pan remains so emotionally powerful. Beneath pirates, fairies, mermaids, and flying children is a fear almost everyone understands. The fear of becoming older and discovering that childhood cannot be recovered once it is gone. As children, growing up sounds like permission. It means staying up later, making your own decisions, becoming independent. As adults, the same process can feel like a countdown. Responsibilities multiply. Relationships change. Parents become older. Choices become permanent. The future stops feeling infinite. And suddenly Peter's greatest fantasy becomes frightening. What if you could actually stop time? What if you never had to change, never had to fail differently, never had to say goodbye? First, that sounds like freedom. But eventually, the absence of change begins to resemble loneliness. That is why revisiting Peter Pan today does not require us to reject the wonder we felt as children. Quite the opposite. The nostalgia matters because it reminds us why the fantasy was so powerful in the first place. We wanted to fly because the world felt enormous. We wanted Neverland because the future was still unknown. We wanted Peter because he seemed to possess the one thing adulthood threatened to take away: endless possibility. The uncomfortable realization comes later. Growing up is frightening because time is real. But refusing to grow means refusing the experiences that give time meaning. Peter escapes aging, yet he may also escape the very things that make a life feel complete. And that is where the childhood fantasy begins to reveal its adult shadow. In 1904, J.M. Barrie introduced Peter Pan on the London stage as Peter Pan, or the boy who wouldn't grow up. The character had already appeared in Barrie's earlier prose, but the play established the version of Neverland that would become a cultural landmark. Barrie later developed the story into the 1911 novel Peter and Wendy. Decades later, Walt Disney saw in that material something that seemed almost designed for animation. Flight, fairies, pirates, transformations, and a world where imagination could ignore the limits of ordinary physics. Disney's interest was not sudden. He had encountered Barrie's story years earlier through a touring stage production, and by 1935 he was seriously considering Peter Pan as a future animated feature. In 1939, Disney arranged permission with Great Ormond Street Hospital, which held the rights Barrie had left to it, allowing the studio to pursue its own screen version. Yet having the rights was not the same as being ready to make the movie. The road from idea to finished film would take more than a decade. Early visual development began with artists exploring what Neverland might look like in animation. David Hall created exploratory storyboards, and the project gradually began taking shape during the early 1940s. Then history intervened. After the United States entered World War II, Disney's production priorities changed dramatically. The studio devoted enormous resources to military training, propaganda, and other government work. D23 records that during the war, the overwhelming majority of Disney's output was war-related. Feature projects that had once seemed central to the studio's future were delayed, reduced, or placed on hold. Peter Pan was therefore trapped in an unusual state. Walt had not abandoned the character, but the film could not simply move forward on its original schedule. Financial pressures made every feature an investment that had to justify itself, while the studio's wartime contracts and package productions became necessary to keep the company functioning. The result was a project repeatedly pushed into the future, waiting for Disney to have the money, personnel, and creative space to return to it. There was another pressure inside the studio as well. Disney's relationship with his artists was becoming increasingly complicated, and the 1941 animators' strike exposed tensions over working conditions, pay, and studio authority. The strike did not by itself create every delay surrounding Peter Pan, but it belonged to the larger upheaval that changed the Disney studio during this period. Disney now had to balance ambition with survival, and that helps explain why the Peter Pan we eventually received is so different from the darker possibilities visible in early development. Barrie's material could be whimsical, melancholy, unsettling, and even cruel. Early Disney concept work explored more threatening versions of Neverland, while the story underwent repeated revisions. Over time, the filmmakers streamlined the narrative, concentrated the conflict around Peter and Captain Hook, and pushed comedy and visual spectacle toward the center. The final film became faster, brighter, and more accessible, transforming complicated source material into a tightly structured adventure. That evolution was not simply a loss of seriousness. It was also a deliberate statement about what Disney believed animation could do. Walt wanted Peter Pan to function as a spectacular visual experience, and he had a personal attachment to the property that stretched back years. In 1952, he described Peter Pan as a story that seemed especially suited to the animated medium, arguing that animation could accomplish things the stage could not. By the time production was underway in earnest, the project represented decades of memory, accumulated artistic experimentation, and one of Walt's long-held ambitions. The numbers reveal just how substantial that ambition became. D23 notes that the film ultimately involved more than 2 years of actual animation, a reported budget of $3 million, and nearly 1 million separate drawings. By the time production was underway in earnest, the project had become one of Walt Disney's longest-standing ambitions. But perhaps the most revealing part of this history is not that Peter Pan took so long. It is why the story had to change while waiting. The Peter Pan of 1953 was born from a tension between two instincts. One wanted to preserve Barrie's questions about childhood, loss, and refusal to grow. The other wanted a movie audiences could embrace. Musical, funny, exciting, and unmistakably Disney. The darker edges were reorganized beneath the surface of a streamlined adventure. So before Neverland became the place we remember, it passed through years of uncertainty, wartime disruption, financial pressure, revision, and determination. The long production history already tells us something essential about the film itself. Peter Pan was never simply about refusing to grow. It was also a story repeatedly forced to grow and change in order to survive. In 1953, Peter Pan did not arrive in a cultural vacuum. It premiered in an America that was rapidly changing its idea of family life, childhood, and entertainment. World War II had ended only a few years earlier, and the country was moving into an era of expanding suburbs, rising consumer spending, television ownership, and a growing emphasis on the nuclear family. Children were becoming an increasingly visible commercial audience, surrounded by toys, comic books, television programs, and advertising designed specifically to capture youthful attention. That environment suited Disney. The studio had survived the financial damage of the war years and was rebuilding its feature animation business. Cinderella had been a crucial turning point in 1950, demonstrating that a traditional fairy tale feature could once again become a major commercial success. Alice in Wonderland followed in 1951, although its initial theatrical performance fell short of the expectations placed on it. Peter Pan therefore entered release with a complicated burden. It had to prove that Disney's recovery was real, while justifying the enormous time and resources invested in it. Walt Disney was no longer operating only as an animation producer. His ambitions had expanded into television, live-action entertainment, merchandise, and the developing Disneyland project. Every successful film could strengthen this larger business ecosystem. A feature did not simply have to sell tickets. It could introduce characters and ideas that continued working for the company long after audiences left the theater. Peter Pan was particularly valuable because it was already recognizable. The story carried decades of cultural familiarity, while Peter, Wendy, Tinker Bell, Captain Hook, the Lost Boys, and the pirate ship offered obvious opportunities for books, toys, costumes, records, promotional appearances, and licensed products. The fantasy world was easy to package because each character had a distinctive silhouette and personality. Tinker Bell was especially important. Her tiny size, expressive design, and association with magic made her immediately recognizable. Captain Hook offered the opposite appeal. Theatrical danger softened by comedy. That contrast allowed Disney to market the film toward children, without making it feel too gentle for parents seeking an adventure. The campaign surrounding the film leaned heavily into spectacle. Disney promoted Peter Pan through the elements audiences could understand immediately: flight, pirates, music, fantasy, comedy, and colorful characters. The central promise was simple. Families could leave the ordinary world behind and enter Neverland. That message mattered in an era when cinema was competing with the growing presence of television inside the home. A theatrical Disney feature had to feel larger than something a family could watch in its living room. The big screen offered color, movement, music, and fantasy on a scale that television could not easily match. When Peter Pan premiered on February 5, 1953, the film arrived backed by Disney publicity. Promotional material emphasized adventure, songs, humor, memorable characters, and visual wonder. Rather than selling Peter Pan as a complicated story about mortality or emotional development, the campaign sold an irresistible fantasy. And that distinction matters. Marketing could sell parents the idea of wonder. It could sell children the promise of flying. It could sell families an evening of laughter and adventure. The darker implications remained inside the fantasy, where they could be experienced without necessarily being named. The timing made the fantasy powerful. America was celebrating youth, consumption, family togetherness, and technological progress, while older generations still lived with the memory of war. In that atmosphere, a boy who refused to grow up could be presented as escapism, but an irony was buried inside the premise. The culture watching Peter Pan in 1953 was obsessed with the future. Families were moving into new homes, children were entering a new consumer economy, and Disney was building businesses that depended on expansion and change. The nation was moving forward at extraordinary speed. Neverland promised the opposite. It offered a place where nothing had to change, where childhood could repeat itself, and where every adventure could begin again tomorrow. That was exactly why the fantasy was so attractive. It was also why Peter Pan carried a contradiction beneath its cheerful marketing. A culture racing toward the future had created a hero whose greatest achievement was refusing to enter it. By the time audiences sat down to watch, Disney had transformed an old literary and theatrical property into a family spectacle. Neverland was packaged as an escape from ordinary life. The audience came expecting magic. What they received was magic along with one question: what does it cost to remain the same while all move on? Before Neverland appears, Peter Pan begins somewhere much more ordinary. A family nursery in Edwardian London. And that contrast is essential. The magic of the story becomes meaningful because it enters a world already organized around rules, responsibilities, and expectations. The Darling household initially feels affectionate, but it is also structured by a clear domestic hierarchy. George Darling expects order and discipline, while Mary Darling brings warmth and imagination into the home. Their children, Wendy, John, and Michael, exist between those two influences. The nursery is their private territory, a place where stories can transform ordinary objects into castles, pirates, and distant islands. Even Nana, the family's Saint Bernard, reflects the strange mixture of affection and responsibility within this household. She functions as the children's nursemaid, watching over them, organizing their routines, and essentially doing a job that would normally belong to a human caregiver. To the children, Nana is part pet and part protector. To the adults, she represents another piece of the household machinery keeping everything under control. And then there is George Darling. He is not introduced as a monster. He is anxious, practical, and concerned with appearances. His frustration comes from believing that childhood has boundaries. Wendy is growing older, and he believes it is time for her to leave the nursery. In his mind, this is simply how life works. The nursery is for children. Eventually, children grow up. And when Wendy reaches that point, she is expected to move into the adult world. That expectation creates the first major conflict of the film. Mary understands that Wendy is changing, but she does not treat imagination as something that must immediately disappear. George sees the nursery differently. To him, Wendy's continued attachment to stories about Peter Pan is evidence that she is holding on to something she should have outgrown. The argument therefore becomes larger than a disagreement between parents. It is the first battle between two definitions of maturity. One says growing up means accepting reality. The other suggests that imagination can survive alongside responsibility. And standing between those ideas is Wendy, who is old enough to understand adulthood but still young enough to believe that somewhere beyond London, Peter Pan might actually exist. Then Peter arrives. His entrance turns the household's ordinary conflict into something extraordinary. He has come looking for something he has lost. His shadow. On the surface, this is a playful piece of fantasy. Peter's shadow has detached itself, and he needs Wendy to help him retrieve and reattach it. But symbolically, the moment is far more revealing. Peter is the boy who claims never to grow up, yet even he is missing a part of himself. His shadow can be understood as a visual representation of identity, memory, and the part of ourselves we cannot simply command into existence. Peter's problem is not merely that his shadow has escaped. It is that he has entered Wendy's world without fully understanding what he has lost. And unlike Wendy, Peter does not seem especially troubled by that incompleteness. He treats the shadow as an inconvenience. That attitude tells us almost everything we need to know about him. Peter can lose something important and immediately turn the problem into another adventure. He does not sit with the meaning of the loss. He does not question why it happened. He simply wants the shadow back so he can continue being Peter Pan. Tinker Bell's arrival makes the encounter even more complicated. She is fiercely attached to Peter, and her jealousy toward Wendy reveals that Neverland is not the consequence-free paradise Peter describes. Even magical friendships contain possessiveness, insecurity, and emotional conflict. So while the darling parents argue about whether Wendy is ready to grow up, Peter appears as the ultimate alternative. He does not negotiate with adulthood. He simply refuses it. That is why his arrival matters so much. Peter does not enter the nursery merely to invite Wendy on an adventure. He represents the temptation to escape the entire process of becoming someone else. The shadow, meanwhile, quietly introduces the cost. Peter wants eternal childhood, but something about him is already incomplete. Before Wendy ever flies toward Neverland, the story has already shown us the central contradiction. The desire to remain unchanged may preserve freedom, but it may also leave parts of the self behind. Once Peter Pan enters the nursery, the rules of ordinary life begin to dissolve. He offers Wendy, John, and Michael something their parents cannot provide: a way out. The method is deceptively simple: pixie dust, a little faith, and the willingness to believe that flying is possible. Peter does not explain the physics because Neverland does not operate according to adult logic. The children simply have to accept the possibility that the impossible can happen, and then they fly. The moment is one of Disney's most enduring images, because it transforms childhood imagination into physical freedom. The children rise above their beds, above the nursery, and eventually above London itself. Gravity no longer decides where they can go. Walls no longer determine where they belong. The rules that seemed permanent only minutes earlier suddenly look optional. Flying therefore becomes more than a magical trick. It represents escape. For Wendy, it is an escape from the expectations beginning to close around her. For John and Michael, it is an escape from the boundaries of childhood as defined by adults. And for Peter, flying is simply his natural state. He has already rejected the world below. He does not need to escape from it because psychologically, he has never accepted its rules in the first place. The journey across London makes that contrast visually unforgettable. The children soar over rooftops, passing the familiar architecture of their city, while becoming increasingly detached from the world they know. London remains below them, structured and predictable. Above it is the open night sky, where distance seems limitless. Then comes Big Ben. The clock is one of the most important images in the sequence because it represents exactly what Peter refuses to acknowledge: time. The children fly past it toward the famous second star to the right and straight on till morning. In a purely visual sense, the moment is exhilarating. The city becomes tiny beneath them, and the stars seem close enough to touch. But symbolically, the children are flying directly away from the clock. That is Peter's promise. Forget time. Forget tomorrow. Forget what you are supposed to become. Just fly. It is easy to understand why that promise feels irresistible. Childhood is filled with rules created by other people. When Peter offers a world where those rules disappear, the freedom feels absolute. But freedom without limits can become dangerous precisely because there is nothing to tell you where the boundary lies. And Neverland proves that almost immediately. The island is introduced as an extraordinary place, but it is also a place where danger hides behind spectacle. Pirates roam the waters. Mermaids can be cruel. The Lost Boys are armed. And even the person who brings Wendy into this world is capable of treating her presence as a threat. Tinker Bell's jealousy becomes especially important here. She sees Wendy not as another child joining the adventure, but as a rival for Peter's attention. Her insecurity leads her toward deception, and she manipulates the Lost Boys into believing that Wendy is the enemy. The result is an attempted attack that nearly kills her. The sequence is disturbing precisely because it happens so quickly. The children have barely entered Neverland before its fantasy begins producing consequences. Wendy's arrival should represent friendship and adventure. Instead, jealousy turns the Lost Boys against her. Peter's world is supposed to be free from adult rules. Yet that freedom has not eliminated violence, possessiveness, or betrayal. It has simply removed the structures that might restrain them. This is the first major crack in Neverland's perfect image. The children believed they were flying toward a paradise where nobody had to grow up. What they discover is something more complicated. A world where childhood impulses can become dangerously powerful because nobody is required to outgrow them. And Peter, the person who seems most comfortable in this environment, does not recognize the contradiction. To him, the adventure continues. To Wendy, the consequences have already begun. That difference will become increasingly important as the story moves deeper into Neverland. Because crossing the threshold does not simply mean entering a magical world. It means entering Peter's worldview and discovering that a place without adulthood is not necessarily a place without danger. Neverland initially looks like a child's dream because everything seems to exist for adventure. There are forests to explore, lagoons to swim through, pirate ships to raid, and hidden places where danger can appear without warning. But as Wendy and her brothers spend more time there, the island begins to reveal a strange structure. Its different groups behave almost like separate kingdoms, each representing a different version of childhood fantasy. The Lost Boys occupy one of the most important spaces. They live without parents, schedules, or conventional rules, and Peter acts as their unquestioned leader. Their freedom sounds appealing, but their lives also expose the loneliness hidden inside Peter's promise. They have escaped adulthood, yet they have no clear path toward anything else. Wendy gradually becomes the missing piece. At first, she arrives as another child seeking adventure. But the Lost Boys quickly begin treating her differently. They want stories, comfort, organization, and someone who can make their chaotic world feel like a home. Wendy becomes a mother figure almost by default. That transformation is one of the story's quietest contradictions. Wendy came to Neverland to avoid growing up, yet she is immediately pushed into a role associated with adulthood. She is expected to care for children, tell them stories, settle disputes, and create emotional stability. Peter offers her freedom, but Neverland keeps asking her to perform responsibility. Then there are the pirates. Captain Hook represents another kind of obsession with Peter. His hatred is personal, and the source of it is brutally simple. Peter cut off Hook's hand and fed it to a crocodile. The creature enjoyed the taste so much that it began pursuing Hook, creating one of the film's most memorable running jokes. But beneath the comedy is something darker. Hook is terrified of time. The crocodile's ticking sound functions almost like a living clock, announcing that the past is still following him. Hook cannot escape what Peter did to him. Every tick reminds him that consequences exist. Peter, meanwhile, appears almost untouched by consequences. That contrast makes their rivalry more interesting than a standard hero versus villain conflict. Hook remembers. Peter does not seem interested in remembering. Hook plans revenge because the past defines him. Peter keeps moving because the past barely seems to exist. The crocodile therefore becomes more than a comic monster. It is the embodiment of inevitability. Hook can run, hide, and scheme, but he cannot permanently escape the thing coming after him. Peter believes he can. That belief is tested when the story moves toward Skull Rock and the rescue of Tiger Lily. The sequence allows Peter to display exactly the qualities that make him appealing: courage, confidence, improvisation, and an almost complete absence of fear. But those same qualities can become recklessness. Peter repeatedly treats danger as entertainment because he assumes he will find a way out. His confidence inspires the children, but it can also put them at risk. He does not approach danger with the caution of someone who understands consequences. He approaches it like a game. That distinction becomes increasingly important. In Neverland, bravery and irresponsibility can look almost identical. Peter's ability to survive reinforces his worldview. Every successful escape tells him that his instincts are correct. Every defeated pirate becomes another reason to believe that rules are unnecessary. But the audience can see something Peter cannot. Survival does not prove that consequences do not exist. Meanwhile, Wendy is learning the opposite lesson. She begins to recognize that every adventure has emotional consequences. People can be frightened. Friends can become jealous. Enemies can be hurt. Choices can leave lasting marks. Neverland is therefore becoming less like a playground and more like a test. Its factions may look like separate children's fantasies, but together they create a miniature society built around conflict, identity, and power. The Lost Boys want belonging. The pirates want control. Hook wants revenge. The mermaids guard their territory. Wendy searches for a sense of home. And Peter wants all of it to remain exactly as it is. That final desire is what holds the island together, and it may eventually be what tears it apart. By the middle of the story, Neverland has stopped feeling like an escape and started revealing what its freedom actually costs. Tinker Bell becomes the clearest example. Her attachment to Peter has always been intense, but jealousy turns that attachment into something destructive. She does not simply want Peter's attention. She wants to protect her position beside him. Wendy's presence threatens that position, and Captain Hook recognizes the weakness immediately. Hook understands something Peter does not. People can be manipulated through what they fear losing. He exploits Tinker Bell's insecurity and possessiveness, convincing her to reveal information about Peter's hideout. She is not acting because she suddenly becomes evil. She is acting because Neverland's supposedly consequence-free relationships have produced very real emotional consequences. Her jealousy becomes a weapon, and Hook knows exactly where to aim it. Meanwhile, Wendy begins to understand that Peter cannot give her what she actually needs. At first, she is fascinated by him because he represents everything adulthood appears to threaten. He is fearless, spontaneous, and permanently young. But the longer she watches him, the more obvious his limitations become. Peter can create adventures, but he cannot create the emotional security of a family. He can lead the Lost Boys, but he does not truly understand what they need. That realization becomes especially powerful when Wendy sings, "Your Mother and Mine." The song changes the emotional atmosphere of Neverland. Instead of celebrating escape, Wendy reminds the children of home. She speaks about a mother's love as something stable, patient, and enduring. For the Lost Boys and her brothers, the memory of their own family becomes stronger than the excitement of the island. And suddenly, Neverland's greatest promise begins to lose its power. Peter can offer endless adventures. A mother can offer belonging. Those are not the same thing. Wendy's growing homesickness is therefore not simply a desire to return to London. It represents her recognition that growing up may involve losing some freedoms, but it also creates relationships capable of lasting beyond a single adventure. Peter does not understand that distinction. He treats Wendy's desire to leave almost as though she is abandoning the fun. But Wendy is beginning to recognize that love cannot survive on excitement alone. Real relationships require memory, vulnerability, sacrifice, and the willingness to change. Those are precisely the things Peter avoids. Then Hook makes his move. With information gained through Tinker Bell, he is able to locate Peter's hideout and ambush the children. The fantasy suddenly collapses into genuine danger. The Lost Boys are captured, Wendy and her brothers are taken aboard the pirate ship, and Peter is left vulnerable. Hook's final plan is especially cruel because it is designed around Peter's own habits. Instead of simply killing him immediately, Hook leaves a ticking time bomb for him. The clock begins counting down. It is another variation of the symbol that has followed Peter since the children first flew over London. Time. But this time, Peter cannot simply fly away from it. The ticking bomb transforms the abstract idea of time into an immediate threat. Peter's entire worldview has depended on pretending that consequences can always be postponed. Now the countdown forces him to confront something he has avoided throughout the story. Eventually, something changes whether you are ready or not. For Wendy, the crisis clarifies what Neverland has become. The island promised freedom, but it also exposed jealousy, violence, manipulation, and abandonment. The children entered believing that never growing up meant never having to face painful realities. Instead, they discover that avoiding maturity does not eliminate pain. It can simply leave you less prepared to understand it. And Peter is about to discover the most frightening version of that lesson. The boy who never grows up has finally been given a deadline. The final act begins with Peter Pan facing the consequence he has spent the entire story avoiding. Hook's bomb is waiting in Peter's hideout, ticking toward its inevitable explosion. Peter does not understand the danger until it is almost too late, and Tinker Bell ultimately sacrifices herself to save him. Her choice matters because it reverses the pattern that jealousy created earlier. Tinker Bell had betrayed Peter because she feared losing him. Now she risks everything to save him. Her actions reveal that love, unlike possessiveness, requires sacrifice. For once, Peter is forced to confront the possibility that another person can value his life more than her own. That realization drives him toward the Jolly Roger. The confrontation with Hook becomes the physical climax of everything the two characters represent. Peter fights with speed, confidence, and almost playful agility. Hook fights with desperation. His movements are heavier, driven not simply by hatred but by years of humiliation and fear. The sword fight therefore feels larger than a contest between a boy and a pirate. Peter moves as though the battle is another game. Hook fights as though his entire identity depends on winning. That difference explains why Peter dominates the encounter. He is still capable of treating danger as play, while Hook has become consumed by the past. His revenge has become his personality. Peter eventually frees Wendy, John, Michael, and the Lost Boys, but Hook's defeat does not come from Peter's sword alone. Once again, the ticking crocodile appears, turning the pirate's greatest fear against him. Hook runs. The terrifying pirate who commanded a ship and threatened children becomes increasingly desperate as the crocodile pursues him. His final humiliation is almost comedic, but it also completes his symbolic role. Hook has spent the entire film trying to defeat Peter, because Peter represents the youth and freedom Hook believes he has lost. Yet Hook cannot defeat time. The crocodile remains behind him, ticking. Peter, meanwhile, seems to escape the same fate. But the story does not end in Neverland. The children eventually return to London aboard the magical pirate ship, transforming the vehicle of danger into a vehicle of homecoming. The journey reverses the flight that began the adventure. Earlier, the children flew away from London because they wanted to escape the expectations waiting for them. Now they return because they have discovered something those expectations could never fully explain. Home is not necessarily the enemy of freedom. Back in the nursery, George Darling experiences his own transformation. The strict father who wanted Wendy to leave the nursery is confronted with the emotional reality of losing her. His perspective softens, and he recognizes that imagination and maturity do not have to be enemies. That change is important because the film refuses to make adulthood completely victorious. George does not suddenly become a perfect father, and Wendy does not return as a child who has learned to obey without question. Instead, the family reaches a more complicated understanding. Growing up does not require destroying childhood. It requires carrying parts of it forward. Wendy accepts this transition willingly. She has experienced the freedom of Neverland and discovered its limitations. She has seen what Peter gains by refusing to change, but she has also seen what he loses. She can now choose adulthood without believing that it means abandoning imagination. That is perhaps the most important difference between Wendy and Peter. Wendy changes because she understands that change is inevitable. Peter refuses because he believes change is the enemy. The final return therefore transforms the meaning of the story. The children did not fail because they grew up. They succeeded because they experienced enough of childhood to understand what should be preserved and what must be released. Peter flies away, remaining exactly as he was. Wendy stays. And in that quiet contrast, the film gives us its most complicated answer. The child who never grows up may be the most recognizable symbol of freedom, but the girl who chooses to grow up is the one who actually moves forward. Neverland can preserve a moment forever. Only the real world can turn that moment into a life. Peter Pan is introduced as the ultimate fantasy of childhood freedom. He is confident, fearless, funny, athletic, and seemingly immune to the limitations that define everyone else. He can fly without hesitation, challenge pirates without fear, and enter impossible situations with the certainty that he will somehow escape. But beneath that confidence is a protagonist whose greatest strength may also be his deepest weakness. Peter's surface goal is simple: never grow up. Yet the more closely we examine that desire, the less it looks like a celebration of youth, and the more it resembles an avoidance strategy. Peter does not simply want to remain young because childhood is enjoyable. He wants to avoid everything that adulthood represents: responsibility, permanence, intimacy, loss, and eventually death. That makes his conflict psychological rather than physical. Captain Hook threatens Peter with a sword, but adulthood threatens him with something much more frightening: change. Peter's refusal to mature also affects his relationships. He can be affectionate toward Wendy, but he struggles to understand what genuine emotional intimacy requires. He enjoys companionship as long as it does not demand vulnerability. When Wendy asks questions about mothers, home, or growing up, Peter often reacts with confusion or irritation, because those subjects challenge the worldview that keeps him comfortable. He wants people around him. He does not necessarily want to become emotionally responsible for them. That distinction explains why Peter can appear charming and narcissistic at the same time. He naturally assumes that others will follow his adventures, accept his decisions, and adapt to his world. His confidence makes him magnetic, but it also makes him strangely self-centered. Neverland revolves around Peter, because he has created a world in which his desires rarely have to accommodate anyone else's. Even his relationship with memory is revealing. Peter's forgetfulness is not treated as an ordinary inconvenience. He can forget events, people, and emotional experiences with astonishing speed. On one level, this makes him behave like an exaggerated child who lives entirely in the present. But psychologically, his inability to hold on to the past can also be interpreted as a defense. Memory creates continuity. If you remember what happened yesterday, then yesterday becomes part of who you are today. You remember mistakes. You remember people you lost. You remember promises. You recognize that your actions have consequences. Peter's world depends on avoiding that continuity. If every adventure can disappear once the next one begins, then grief never has to become permanent. Loss can be forgotten before it becomes identity. Pain can be replaced with excitement. The problem is that the same mechanism that protects Peter from suffering also prevents him from developing. He does not accumulate experience in the way Wendy does. Wendy remembers. She compares the excitement of Neverland with the comfort of home. She begins to understand what she values and why. She can look backward and forward simultaneously, which is one of the basic requirements of maturity. Peter remains trapped in the present. That is why Wendy is arguably the true emotional protagonist of the story. Peter may drive the adventure, but Wendy experiences the transformation. She begins in London, already standing between childhood and adulthood. She loves imagination but feels the pressure to mature. Neverland gives her the chance to postpone that decision. Yet the adventure ultimately teaches her what Peter cannot learn. She discovers that growing up does not mean becoming empty or unimaginative. It means developing a deeper relationship with time. Wendy learns that memories matter, because they allow people to carry relationships forward. She learns that responsibility can coexist with love. She learns that leaving childhood behind does not require destroying it. Peter learns almost none of these things. That is what makes his character tragic. He appears to possess everything a child could want, yet his eternal youth prevents him from experiencing the emotional development that gives those experiences meaning. He can have endless adventures, but he cannot build a stable life from them. His immortality is therefore less like a superpower and more like a locked room. He is not trapped because Neverland refuses to let him leave. He is trapped because leaving would require him to become someone he is terrified of becoming. And that makes Peter Pan's greatest fear surprisingly human. Beneath the flying, fighting, laughter, and bravado is a character confronting the same truth everyone eventually faces. Time changes us, relationships change us, and growing up means accepting that some things cannot remain forever. Peter's solution is to reject the process entirely. Wendy's solution is harder. She accepts it. Captain Hook appears to be everything Peter Pan is not. He is an adult, an authority figure, a pirate captain dressed in elaborate clothing, obsessed with etiquette, reputation, and control. Yet the closer we look, the more obvious the irony becomes. Hook may have grown older, but emotionally he has never truly escaped the childish world he shares with Peter. His obsession with Peter is remarkably personal. Hook does not simply want to defeat an enemy. He wants to erase the humiliation Peter inflicted upon him. Losing his hand was physically devastating, but the deeper wound is psychological. Peter turned Hook into a joke, and Hook cannot tolerate that loss of dignity. His revenge therefore becomes a desperate attempt to restore the identity he believes Peter stole from him. That makes Hook a strange mirror of Peter. Peter refuses to grow because he wants to remain free from responsibility. Hook desperately clings to status because he cannot accept vulnerability. One rejects adulthood, the other performs it. Peter dresses himself in eternal childhood, while Hook surrounds himself with aristocratic manners, expensive clothing, formal speech, and the authority of a ship's captain. But underneath those surfaces, both are driven by ego. Peter expects others to follow him because he believes he is exceptional. Hook expects others to obey him for the same reason. Peter wants Neverland to remain his playground. Hook wants to control it. Neither is particularly comfortable with a world in which someone else possesses power. That is why their rivalry feels almost inevitable. They are opposites on the surface but surprisingly similar underneath. Hook's greatest psychological weakness, however, is not Peter. It is time. The ticking crocodile is one of the most brilliant symbols in the film, because it transforms an invisible concept into something Hook can hear. The ticking announces that something is approaching. Hook cannot negotiate with it, intimidate it, or defeat it through authority. He can only run. The crocodile therefore becomes a physical manifestation of mortality. Every tick reminds Hook that he cannot remain powerful forever. His body has already been damaged. His hand is gone. His reputation has been wounded. His greatest enemy is not merely the boy who injured him but the passage of time itself. Peter does not seem to hear the same clock. That is the central difference between them. Peter believes time does not matter because he refuses to acknowledge it. Hook is terrified precisely because he knows it does. The result is an unusual psychological inversion. The adult is obsessed with the consequences of aging, while the child has escaped the awareness of aging altogether. Hook understands mortality and cannot accept it. Peter avoids mortality by refusing to think about the future. Neither response is particularly healthy. Hook's behavior becomes increasingly unstable, because his entire identity depends on controlling the uncontrollable. His elegant manners collapse into screaming fits. His theatrical sophistication disappears whenever Peter humiliates him. One moment he behaves like a refined gentleman. The next, he is shouting, panicking, and desperately fleeing from a crocodile. The contrast is what makes him compelling. Hook is not frightening because he is constantly calm. He is frightening because his composure is fragile. The more his control slips, the more violently he attempts to regain it. And yet there is something almost tragic about him. Hook has spent his life building an identity around prestige, authority, and fear, only to discover that none of those things can protect him from humiliation or mortality. He has become trapped inside the very role he created. In that sense, Hook represents another form of arrested development. Peter says, "I will never become an adult." Hook behaves as though adulthood means, "I must never appear weak." Both positions are rooted in fear. Peter fears becoming responsible for other people. Hook fears becoming insignificant. This is why their conflict works on a symbolic level beyond the simple hero versus villain structure. Peter and Hook are fighting over Neverland, but they are also fighting over what it means to possess power over time. Peter wants to stop the clock. Hook wants to defeat the clock. Neither can. The crocodile keeps ticking. And perhaps that is why Hook's defeat feels strangely appropriate. When the crocodile finally chases him away, Hook is not simply losing a battle against Peter. He is being reminded once again that the thing he fears most cannot be defeated through pride, violence, or authority. Time continues. Peter flies onward. Hook runs from the clock. And between them, the film quietly suggests that refusing to accept change can imprison a person just as completely as refusing to grow. If Peter Pan and Captain Hook represent the story's central psychological conflict, the supporting characters reveal what that conflict does to everyone around them. Neverland may revolve around Peter, but it becomes emotionally understandable through characters who react to him in completely different ways. Tinker Bell is perhaps the most fascinating example. She barely speaks, yet her personality is unmistakable. Through pantomime animation, posture, facial expressions, gestures, and sudden changes in movement, the animators give her an emotional vocabulary that requires almost no dialogue. A glance can communicate suspicion. A gesture can reveal jealousy. A burst of movement can express anger, affection, or humiliation. That was an extraordinary choice for a major character. Tinker Bell's design also contributes to her personality. She is tiny, visually delicate, and constantly surrounded by magical light. Yet her emotions are enormous. Her physical size contrasts with the intensity of her reactions. She can be charming one moment and furious the next. Her relationship with Peter is equally complicated. She clearly cares for him deeply, but her affection is not entirely healthy. Her jealousy toward Wendy reveals that she wants Peter's attention exclusively. Wendy's arrival threatens the emotional position Tinker Bell believes she occupies beside him. That makes her betrayal understandable without making it harmless. She allows insecurity to override judgment, but later proves that her attachment to Peter is capable of becoming self-sacrificial. Her character therefore moves through a compressed emotional cycle: affection, jealousy, betrayal, regret, and loyalty. Unlike Peter, she actually experiences emotional consequences. Wendy provides the strongest contrast. Inside a world where almost everyone behaves irrationally, Wendy becomes the emotional anchor. She can enjoy fantasy without completely losing her connection to reality. She believes in Peter, flies to Neverland, and embraces adventure. But she also understands something Peter repeatedly ignores. People need care, security, and belonging. That is why Wendy gradually becomes a maternal figure for the lost boys. She does not enter Neverland intending to become their mother. It simply happens because the boys have created a life without stable adult care. They need someone to tell stories, organize them, comfort them, and make their underground home feel less like a hiding place. The irony is unmistakable. Wendy goes to Neverland to postpone adulthood, and immediately discovers that other children need her maturity. She becomes the bridge between imagination and responsibility. The Lost Boys reinforce this idea. As a group, they embody the freedom Peter promises, but they also reveal its loneliness. They have no parents, no conventional future, and no clear reason to change. Their enthusiasm is genuine, but their dependence on Peter suggests that endless childhood is not entirely liberating. Then there is Mr. Smee. Compared with Hook's theatrical instability, Smee is remarkably grounded. He is comic, practical, and strangely domestic. He does not possess Hook's obsession with dignity, yet he supports Hook's authority and helps maintain the daily machinery of the pirate ship. That makes Smee more than comic relief. He functions as an enabler. Hook can rage, scheme, panic, and demand revenge partly because Smee absorbs the ordinary responsibilities surrounding him. Smee helps prepare meals, follows orders, manages practical tasks, and often reacts to Hook's madness with a patience that resembles a caretaker dealing with an impossible employer. Their relationship creates one of the film's funniest contrasts. Hook wants to appear terrifying and sophisticated. Smee treats him like a difficult person who still needs help getting through the day. That dynamic makes Hook more human, while simultaneously making his villainy more absurd. The pirate captain may imagine himself as a grand figure of power, but someone still has to keep track of the everyday details. Together, these supporting characters create a network around Peter that exposes his limitations. Tinker Bell shows what happens when affection becomes possessive. Wendy shows what happens when imagination develops alongside emotional maturity. The Lost Boys demonstrate the loneliness hidden inside permanent childhood. Smee reveals how even a theatrical villain can depend on ordinary care. And that is why these characters matter. They are not simply decorations inside Peter's adventure. Each one reflects a different response to attachment, responsibility, jealousy, and belonging. Peter wants everyone to remain inside his world. But the people around him are changing. Tinker Bell learns loyalty through sacrifice. Wendy discovers that maturity does not destroy imagination. The Lost Boys experience the possibility of returning home. Even Hook is forced to confront the limits of his obsession. Peter alone remains almost perfectly still. The supporting cast therefore accomplishes something Peter cannot. They give Neverland emotional movement. While the boy who never grows up stays exactly the same, everyone around him becomes a little more aware of what growing up actually means. At the heart of Peter Pan is a deceptively simple conflict. Should we grow up, or should we remain children forever? The film's answer becomes more complicated the longer we examine it. Growing up is presented as inevitable, but it is not portrayed as something purely positive. Childhood contains wonder, freedom, imagination, and the ability to believe without demanding proof. Adulthood brings responsibility, loss, compromise, and the awareness that time cannot be reversed. Peter chooses the first world and rejects the second, but the film gradually reveals the price of that choice. Permanent youth sounds beautiful because it removes aging. Yet without change there is no development. Without development, identity becomes frozen. Peter can experience endless adventures, but he cannot accumulate the emotional growth that turns experiences into wisdom. That is why eternal childhood can resemble a kind of spiritual death. Peter is physically alive and endlessly active, but emotionally he remains suspended. He does not mature through his experiences because he refuses to carry their consequences forward. His life becomes an endless repetition of the same adventure, rather than a journey toward a deeper self. Wendy chooses differently. She discovers that growing up does not mean abandoning imagination. It means learning how to carry imagination into a more complicated life. She can remember Neverland without needing to remain there. That distinction is crucial. The film also places motherhood at the center of this conflict. Wendy's role with the Lost Boys demonstrates how quickly children deprived of structure begin searching for it. They want stories, comfort, routine, and affection. Their fantasy world gives them freedom, but freedom alone cannot provide emotional security. Motherhood therefore becomes both a burden and a sanctuary. Wendy is expected to care for others, and that responsibility limits her freedom. Yet it also gives her a sense of purpose that Peter's endless adventures cannot provide. The nursery, the family, and the idea of returning home represent a different kind of magic. The security created through lasting relationships. This does not mean the film presents domestic life as perfect. George Darling's strictness shows that family structure can become controlling. The adult world can suppress imagination when it becomes obsessed with rules. But the solution is not to eliminate structure altogether. The story suggests that healthy maturity requires both. You need imagination to dream. You need responsibility to turn those dreams into something meaningful. That brings us to the film's most complicated theme: imagination itself. Imagination is one of the greatest gifts childhood offers. It allows children to transform ordinary rooms into magical kingdoms and impossible dreams into temporary realities. Without imagination, Neverland could never exist. But imagination can also become a trap when it is used only to escape reality. Peter does exactly that. He does not use fantasy to enrich his life. He uses it to avoid the parts of life he fears. Neverland becomes a place where he never has to confront aging, grief, responsibility, or permanence. That is the difference between escaping reality for a moment and escaping from reality altogether. The first can restore us. The second can imprison us. Peter Pan therefore refuses to condemn childhood, just as it refuses to glorify adulthood. Instead, it argues for movement between the two. Childhood should not be erased because wonder is valuable. But childhood cannot become a permanent destination without becoming destructive. The bittersweet truth is that growing up means losing something. Wendy cannot remain exactly who she was. But she gains something Peter cannot: the ability to change while still remembering where she came from. And perhaps that is the film's deepest message. Growing up is not the death of childhood. It is learning how to let childhood become part of you, instead of allowing it to become the prison around you. Peter Pan communicates many of its deepest ideas without explaining them. The film constantly uses color, shape, movement, and recurring images to create a visual language beneath the dialogue. London and Neverland are not simply two locations. They represent two different ways of experiencing life. London is structured, orderly, and comparatively restrained. The Darling home is filled with furniture, walls, windows, clocks, and clearly defined spaces. Everything has a place. The nursery itself feels warm and imaginative, but it still exists inside an adult-controlled world. Neverland is the opposite. Its landscapes are larger, brighter, and more saturated. The colors feel stronger because the environment is designed around fantasy, rather than ordinary reality. Forests, oceans, skies, pirates, fairies, and tropical locations create a visual world where boundaries appear almost limitless. That contrast reinforces the central conflict. London represents structure. Neverland represents possibility, but neither world is entirely good or bad. Peter's shadow introduces the first major symbolic complication. It is physically detached from him, moving independently and refusing to behave properly. At first, the sequence is played for comedy, but the image carries an obvious psychological suggestion. Peter wants to define himself as completely free. His shadow refuses to cooperate. It becomes an unruly fragment of identity that Peter cannot simply control. He can fly away from London, reject adulthood, and ignore responsibility, but he cannot completely escape the parts of himself that follow him. The shadow therefore resembles an alter ego. It is attached to Peter but not entirely obedient to him. Its separation suggests that Peter's identity is less complete than his confidence suggests. Then there are the clocks. Timepieces appear throughout the story as reminders of the reality Peter wants to avoid. The most obvious example is Big Ben, which the children pass during their flight to Neverland. The clock stands in the middle of London like a monument to time itself. Peter flies past it, but flying past something does not make it disappear. The ticking crocodile makes the symbol even more direct. For Hook, time becomes audible. The crocodile's ticking announces an approaching consequence that cannot be reasoned with or defeated. Hook can command pirates, threaten enemies, and maintain an elaborate appearance of authority, but he cannot command time. The irony is that Hook is haunted by time while Peter appears untouched by it. One fears aging. The other refuses to acknowledge it. Both are responding to the same reality. Color deepens this contrast. Peter's famous forest green clothing visually connects him with nature, youth, movement, and the untamed world. Green makes him feel like a creature of Neverland itself, someone who belongs to forests rather than houses, schedules, and social rules. Hook's crimson clothing creates a dramatically different impression. Red can suggest blood, danger, aggression, vanity, and authority. Hook's costume is theatrical because Hook himself is theatrical. He wants to be seen as powerful. The colors therefore reinforce their opposing identities. Peter blends into the wild. Hook announces himself. Peter seems naturally part of Neverland. Hook attempts to dominate it. The stars provide another important image. The second star to the right becomes the guide toward Neverland, turning the night sky into a map toward possibility. Stars are distant, beautiful, and unreachable, yet Peter presents one as though it were an invitation. For Wendy, following the star means leaving childhood boundaries behind for a moment. For Peter, it is simply the direction home. That difference becomes increasingly important. The same visual symbols can carry different meanings depending on who is looking at them. A clock can represent anxiety to Hook, and simply another object to Peter. A star can represent adventure to a child and distance to an adult. A shadow can be a joke on the surface while suggesting psychological fragmentation underneath. This is what makes the film's visual language so effective. Peter Pan does not need to tell us that time is frightening. It shows us the clock. It does not need to explain that Peter is divided. It gives him a shadow. It does not need to announce the contrast between freedom and authority. It puts a boy dressed in green opposite a pirate dressed in red. The fantasy is bright. The symbolism underneath it is anything but simple. The deeper meanings of Peter Pan become especially interesting when we stop asking what Neverland is and start asking what Neverland might represent. On the surface, it is an actual magical island. But psychologically, it can also be understood as a fantasy created to escape the pain of separation. Children experience moments when the adults they depend on become distant, when families change, or when the world suddenly feels less secure. Neverland offers the perfect response to that fear. A place where nobody has to leave, nobody has to become older, and every separation can be postponed. But that promise contains a contradiction. If Neverland exists to prevent loss, then forgetting becomes strangely important. Peter does not seem capable of carrying the past with him in the way Wendy does. Adventures disappear. Relationships fade. People who once mattered can become almost irrelevant once they are no longer physically present. His memory protects him from grief, But it also prevents emotional continuity. That makes Neverland feel less like a paradise, and more like a coping mechanism that has become permanent. A child might escape into imagination because reality hurts. Peter has escaped so completely that he no longer knows how to return. This idea becomes even more fascinating when we consider the connection between George Darling and Captain Hook. In Barrie's theatrical tradition, the two roles were famously designed to be played by the same actor. The casting creates an intentional parallel. The strict father in London and the theatrical pirate in Neverland can be understood as two versions of adult authority. Disney preserves that connection by having Hans Conried provide the voice for both characters. The effect is subtle but powerful. George represents the adult world Peter resists. Hook represents the fantasy world enemy Peter fights. Yet both are expressions of authority, discipline, pride, and masculine control. Peter's conflict with Hook can therefore be read as an exaggerated fantasy version of his conflict with adulthood itself. In London, authority tells Wendy it is time to grow up. In Neverland, authority arrives as a pirate captain trying to capture Peter. The costumes change. The underlying tension remains. That interpretation also changes the meaning of Peter's relationship with Wendy. Wendy is not simply another companion he will eventually leave behind. She represents memory, emotional continuity, and the possibility of a relationship that exists beyond a single adventure. And Peter cannot truly provide that. His tragedy is not that Wendy leaves Neverland. His tragedy is that he will eventually forget that she was ever there. The implication is especially painful because Wendy is encouraged to remember him. She carries the experience into adulthood. Peter carries almost nothing forward. He remains young partly because he does not allow the past to accumulate. This creates one of the darkest ideas in the entire story. Peter can keep meeting new children because he never truly remembers the old ones. Every new friendship feels permanent to the child entering Neverland. But from Peter's perspective, permanence may be impossible, because his memory keeps resetting the emotional world around him. That means Neverland's eternal childhood has a hidden cost. Nobody really gets to grow together. Nobody builds a shared history. Nobody becomes old enough to remember the beginning. The fantasy survives by destroying continuity. Modern audiences may therefore interpret Peter Pan differently from the audiences who first encountered it. The filmmakers were creating a colorful family adventure, and much of the darker material was softened through comedy, music, and spectacle. Yet the underlying ideas inherited from Barrie were never completely erased. They remain visible in the structure of the story. Peter wants to escape separation. Wendy learns to accept it. Hook fears time. Peter ignores it. George demands maturity. Wendy discovers that maturity does not require abandoning imagination. And perhaps the most heartbreaking possibility is that Peter will continue exactly as he always has. Meeting children, taking them to Neverland, enjoying their company, and eventually forgetting them when they return home. For Wendy, Neverland becomes a memory. For Peter, memory itself is the thing he cannot keep. And that is why the boy who never grows up may also be the boy who never gets to truly remember. One reason Peter Pan continues to feel visually alive is that its magic was not created by technology in the modern sense. It was created by artists who had to solve every movement, expression, and camera effect by hand. By 1953, Walt Disney's legendary 9 old men had become the studio's core animation force, and Peter Pan gave several of them opportunities to demonstrate radically different approaches to character movement. Milt Kahl was assigned Peter and Wendy, while Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston worked on characters including Captain Hook and Mr. Smee. Mark Davis, meanwhile, brought his distinctive animation style to Tinker Bell. The result is a film where characters do not simply move differently because they have different costumes. They move differently because they have different personalities. Kahl's work on Peter is particularly important. Peter needs to appear light, athletic, confident, and almost impossible to contain. His body language is loose when he is playing, sharp when he is fighting, and effortlessly balanced when he is flying. His movements often feel like those of a dancer or gymnast rather than an ordinary child. Wendy requires the opposite quality. Her movements are more grounded and controlled. She is still a child, but her physical behavior gradually communicates emotional maturity. Even when she is surrounded by impossible events, her poses often provide a sense of stability. That contrast helps the audience understand the characters before they even speak. Then there is Hook. Frank Thomas and the other animators working on the Pirates faced a different challenge. Hook is theatrical. He is elegant, exaggerated, vain, and emotionally unstable. His body needs to communicate authority one second and panic the next. His movements are therefore larger than Peter's. Hook gestures dramatically, reacts violently, and uses his entire body to express frustration. Smee, by comparison, moves with a softer, more grounded physicality. Their animation becomes part of the joke. Hook behaves like a grand stage villain while Smee moves like an ordinary person trying to keep up with him. Tinker Bell presents another technical challenge. Because she does not speak, Mark Davis and the animation team had to make her emotions readable almost entirely through pantomime. Her tiny body becomes a complete emotional instrument. The angle of her head, the position of her arms, the speed of her movement, and even the way she reacts to other characters communicate what dialogue normally would. That level of visual acting is one reason she became so iconic. But the most technically demanding sequences may be the flying scenes. Animating a character who is supposed to float through the air creates an immediate problem. The audience has to believe the character has no weight while still feeling that the body possesses momentum. Peter does not simply move across the screen. He rises, turns, dives, accelerates, stops, and changes direction with a physical rhythm that makes flight appear natural within the rules of Neverland. The children gradually become more confident in the air, allowing their bodies to move from uncertain poses into graceful arcs. The environment also had to move convincingly around them. This is where the multiplane camera became essential. Disney's multiplane system allowed artwork painted on separate layers to move at different speeds and distances from the camera, creating an illusion of depth that flat animation could not achieve as easily. The technology had already been used in earlier Disney productions, but Peter Pan benefited enormously from it during the nighttime flight over London. The city does not look like a single painted background. Buildings, streets, rooftops, and atmospheric layers appear to occupy different distances. As the camera moves, the environment creates the sensation that Wendy, John, Michael, and Peter are actually traveling through three-dimensional space. The effect is particularly powerful because the sequence begins from a familiar human scale. The nursery is enclosed. London is expansive. The sky is limitless. The camera movement helps the audience feel that transition physically. This is what makes the flight sequence more than a beautiful piece of animation. The technology supports the story's emotional idea. The world literally appears to open as the children leave the restrictions of home behind. Yet the artistry remains almost invisible. That is the greatest achievement. We do not watch Peter Pan thinking about how many drawings were required to make Peter turn in the air, or how layers of painted backgrounds create depth. We simply believe that a boy is flying over London with 3 children behind him. The technology disappears. The character animation takes over. And that is precisely what the best animation does. It makes impossible things feel emotionally real. Peter Pan was not shaped by a single director in the modern sense. Its visual and narrative identity emerged from the combined work of Hamilton Luske, Clyde Geronimi, and Wilfred Jackson, all operating within Walt Disney's larger creative system. Each director brought a different strength to the production, while Walt remained deeply involved in the decisions that determined what the finished film would become. One of the studio's most useful tools was live-action reference footage. Before animators could draw Peter flying, Wendy reacting to danger, or Hook exploding into theatrical rage, actors performed the scenes on a soundstage. Bobby Driscoll provided the physical reference for Peter, Catherine Beaumont performed as Wendy, and Hans Conried's performance helped establish Hook's distinctive mannerisms. The reference footage was never intended to become the animation itself. Instead, it gave the artists a physical foundation. They could study how a body shifted its weight, how an expression changed during dialogue, how a character turned, paused, reacted, or entered a room. Then they could exaggerate those movements to fit the logic of animation. This distinction was crucial. Live action follows the limitations of the human body. Animation can break those limitations. Peter needed to feel physically believable enough for the audience to accept him as a child, but exaggerated enough to appear almost weightless and supernatural. Wendy required recognizable human movement, yet her reactions needed to remain readable from a distance. Hook could begin with the gestures of an actor, and then be pushed far beyond realism, until every movement reflected his theatrical personality. Hans Conried was particularly valuable, because Hook's character depended heavily on performance. His voice, posture, timing, and comic indignation all helped define the pirate. The animators could translate those qualities into exaggerated poses, without losing the human behavior underneath them. That balance between realism and caricature became one of the central directorial challenges. Peter Pan needed to feel like a coherent story, but it also needed the speed and exaggeration audiences expected from animation. Dialogue scenes could play like theater, with characters standing, speaking, and reacting to one another. Then the film could suddenly accelerate into physical comedy, sword fights, flying sequences, or chaotic pirate business. The directors had to control that rhythm carefully. Too much realism would make Neverland feel ordinary. Too much caricature would weaken the emotional stakes. The solution was contrast. A quiet scene could establish a character's emotional reality, before a sudden burst of visual comedy released the tension. Hook's conversations might begin with elaborate manners before collapsing into panic. Peter could speak casually and then launch himself through the air. Wendy could discuss something emotionally serious, while the world around her remained completely fantastical. Walt Disney's involvement was essential to maintaining that balance. Although the directors handled the day-to-day construction of sequences, Walt continued to review storyboards, animation, music, and pacing. His approach was often practical rather than sentimental. If a sequence slowed the story, it could be shortened. If a song did not advance the narrative, it could be reconsidered. If a joke strengthened a character, it might stay even if it complicated the original tone. That process helped transform a sprawling adaptation into a more streamlined feature. Barry's story contained many possibilities, but animation could not explore every one of them equally. Scenes had to earn their place. Characters needed clear functions. Songs needed to maintain momentum. The film had to move quickly enough to keep younger audiences engaged, while giving the major emotional beats room to register. This explains why the final Peter Pan feels more concentrated than the literary world that inspired it. The production repeatedly asked the same question. What belongs in the movie? Some ideas were softened. Others were removed. Still others were transformed into comedy or visual spectacle. The result was not a literal translation of Barry's work. It was an interpretation shaped by the strengths and limitations of animation, the personalities of the artists, and Walt Disney's insistence on entertainment value.